When Private Thomas Atkins of the Worcestershire Regiment lit a cigarette for a wounded German soldier lying in a shell crater near Pilcombe Ridge on July 31st, 1917, his hands were still shaking from the combat that had just ended minutes earlier, and the German prisoner's blood was soaking into the mud between them. The act of offering a cigarette to an enemy who moments before had been trying to kill him seemed almost absurd. Yet Atkins later wrote in his diary that it felt like the only human thing to do when confronted with a man who was no longer a threat, but simply another soldier suffering in the same mud, the same fear, and the same exhaustion that characterized warfare on the Western Front. What made this gesture remarkable was not its uniqueness, but rather its ordinariness. As documented photographs and countless personal accounts reveal that British soldiers routinely offered cigarettes to captured Germans throughout World War I and World War II, transforming tobacco from a personal comfort into an instrument of unexpected humanity that bridged the divide between enemies and acknowledged shared suffering that transcended national boundaries. The cultural significance of cigarettes in British military life during both world wars cannot be overstated, as tobacco had become so central to soldier identity that the archetypal image of the British Tommy included a cigarette hanging from his lips as much as his rifle and tin helmet. By World War I, cigarettes had evolved from a luxury item to an essential component of military rations, with the British Army recognizing that tobacco served psychological functions as important as food or ammunition for maintaining morale in the appalling conditions of trench warfare. One officer quoted in contemporary accounts maintained that if soldiers could get their cigarettes, they were content, paying no heed to discomfort in trenches or on marches in the worst weather, and even if rations failed, they would not complain if cigarettes did not. This dependency on tobacco meant that British soldiers carried cigarettes as routinely as they carried ammunition, and the abundance of tobacco in their possession created opportunities for the sharing that would characterize interactions with captured enemies. The practice of offering cigarettes to prisoners began with practical and humanitarian considerations rooted in Geneva Convention obligations and British military culture. The Hague Convention of 1907 had established laws requiring humane treatment of prisoners, stipulating that captured soldiers must be treated with humanity and that their personal dignity be respected. British military training emphasized these obligations, teaching soldiers that once an enemy surrendered, he became a prisoner of war entitled to protection rather than an object of continued violence. The cigarette offer served multiple functions within this framework. It provided immediate comfort to men who were often wounded, frightened, and disoriented by capture. It established a non-verbal communication of peaceful intent that transcended language barriers, and it created a moment of shared humanity that helped both captor and captive transition from the psychology of combat to the different relationship of guard and prisoner. The symbolic power of sharing tobacco crossed national and linguistic boundaries in ways that few other gestures could match. Soldiers who spoke no common language could communicate goodwill through the universal ritual of lighting and smoking cigarettes together, creating temporary bonds that acknowledged their shared status as men trapped in circumstances neither had chosen. During the famous Christmas truce of 1914, German and British soldiers who emerged from their trenches to fraternize in no man's land exchanged cigarettes alongside other gifts, with photographs showing troops from opposing armies huddled together to light up, the act of sharing tobacco becoming one of the most visible symbols of the spontaneous peace that briefly interrupted the war. These exchanges revealed that beneath the uniforms and national identities were ordinary men who recognized in each other the common experience of being cold, scared and far from home, with cigarettes serving as the medium through which this recognition could be expressed. British soldier Frederick James Hodges, whose letters home were preserved by his family, described capturing a young German soldier during fighting in 1916 who appeared to be barely 18 years old and was crying from fear and shock. Hodges wrote that he gave the German his cigarettes and tried to calm him down, explaining through gestures that he would not be harmed. The German soldier's transformation from terrified prisoner to someone who could accept comfort revealed the psychological impact of small acts of kindness in moments of extreme stress. Hodges noted that other British soldiers gathered around, and several offered the German food and water in addition to cigarettes, transforming what could have been a moment of triumph over a defeated enemy into something more complex that acknowledged the Germans' humanity despite his recent status as a threat. The abundance of cigarettes available to British troops through rations and charitable organizations made sharing possible on a scale that might not have been feasible otherwise. British soldiers received regular tobacco rations, and charitable organizations including the YMCA and Red Cross distributed additional cigarettes to troops, with the Red Cross alone distributing hundreds of thousands of cigarettes weekly to British forces. Fundraising efforts on the home front specifically collected tobacco and cigarettes for soldiers, with events like pipe and tobacco dances raising thousands of cigarettes to be sent to the front. This abundant supply meant that British soldiers could afford to be generous with captured enemies without significantly depleting their own supply, making the gesture practical as well as humanitarian. The contrast between British practice of offering cigarettes to prisoners and the variable treatment prisoners received in other contexts revealed something distinctive about British military culture, and its emphasis on maintaining standards of conduct even in brutal circumstances. While prisoner treatment varied across different armies and different theatres of war, British forces generally maintained reputations for following Geneva Convention requirements and treating captured enemies according to established rules. The cigarette offer became one visible manifestation of this commitment, a small gesture that symbolized adherence to civilized norms in the uncivilized context of warfare. Not every British soldier offered cigarettes to every prisoner. Undocumented cases exist of prisoners being mistreated or killed after surrender, but the frequency with which tobacco sharing appears in accounts and photographs suggests it represented common practice rather than exceptional behavior. The psychological dimensions of offering cigarettes to just captured enemies involved complex processes through which soldiers managed the transition from combat psychology to the different mindset required for handling prisoners. During active combat, soldiers were trained to view enemies as threats to be eliminated, with survival depending on the ability to shoot without hesitation or moral qualms. The moment of surrender required a rapid psychological shift from seeing the enemy as a target to recognizing him as a human being who had become helpless and was now under British protection. The act of offering a cigarette facilitated this transition, creating a ritual through which the British soldier could signal to himself as much as to the prisoner that the combat phase had ended and a different relationship had begun. Lighting a cigarette for a wounded enemy required physical proximity and momentary vulnerability that would have been suicidal minutes earlier, but that now served as proof that both men had survived to move beyond the immediate killing. The photographic record of British soldiers offering cigarettes to German prisoners provides visual documentation of this practice across both world wars. A particularly well-known photograph from the Battle of Pilkem Ridge shows a British soldier holding a cigarette for a wounded German to smoke, the image capturing a moment of tenderness amid the carnage that surrounded them. Similar photographs from World War II show British troops sharing cigarettes with captured German and Italian soldiers, the visual evidence confirming that the practice persisted across generations and conflicts. These images circulated widely in newspapers and magazines, serving propaganda purposes by demonstrating British adherence to civilized warfare standards while also documenting genuine moments of human connection that transcended the propaganda intent. German prisoners who received cigarettes from British captors sometimes mentioned these gestures in letters or post-war accounts, describing their surprise at being treated with basic decency rather than the brutality they had been conditioned to expect. Nazi propaganda had portrayed the British as decadent and potentially cruel, and German soldiers approaching capture often feared harsh treatment or even execution. The offer of a cigarette, particularly when accompanied by medical attention or food, contradicted these expectations and forced German prisoners to reconsider their assumptions about their enemies. Some prisoners described the cigarette moment as the point when they began to believe they might survive captivity, the small gesture of sharing tobacco becoming psychologically significant beyond the physical comfort the cigarette provided. The continuation of cigarette sharing practices into World War II, despite the more ideologically charged nature of that conflict, revealed the persistence of certain humanitarian traditions in British military culture. World War II involved fighting against an enemy whose regime had committed atrocities that made maintaining humanitarian standards toward captured Germans morally complex for British soldiers who learned about concentration camps and Nazi war crimes. Despite this moral complexity, documented accounts and photographs show British soldiers continuing to offer cigarettes to German prisoners, maintaining practices established in the previous war, even when dealing with an enemy whose leadership had abandoned all pretense of civilized warfare. This persistence suggests that the cigarette-sharing ritual had become embedded in British military culture as part of how soldiers defined themselves and their adherence to standards that distinguished them from enemies who had discarded such standards. The medical and psychological benefits of tobacco that soldiers believed in during both world wars provided additional justification for sharing cigarettes with prisoners. Contemporary understanding viewed smoking as calming nerves and providing psychological relief from stress, though decades would pass before the health dangers of tobacco became widely acknowledged. British soldiers who offered cigarettes to shell-shocked or wounded prisoners believed they were providing genuine medical comfort in addition to showing humanity, and military medical personnel sometimes used tobacco as a mild sedative for treating traumatized patients. This belief in tobacco's medicinal properties meant that sharing cigarettes with prisoners could be understood as a form of first aid, providing immediate psychological stabilization that helped prisoners cope with the shock and trauma of combat and capture. The internal debates among British soldiers about whether captured enemies deserved such kindness revealed tensions between the emotional demands of warfare and adherence to civilized standards. Some soldiers argued that enemies who had killed British comrades deserved no comfort or courtesy, that offering cigarettes to Germans represented misplaced sympathy that honored the enemy above the fallen. Others maintained that treating prisoners humanely, regardless of what their side had done, represented what separated the British from their enemies, that maintaining standards of conduct defined who they were as individuals and as a nation. These debates appeared in letters, diaries and memoirs revealing that the act of sharing cigarettes was not automatic or uncontested, but rather represented conscious choices soldiers made about what kind of men they wanted. To be in the midst of circumstances that could have justified abandoning all humanitarian gestures. Looking back at the practice of British soldiers sharing cigarettes with captured enemies reveals something fundamental about how individuals maintain humanity in dehumanizing circumstances. The cigarette offered to a wounded German in a muddy shell crater, or a frightened prisoner fresh from surrender, represented a gesture that acknowledged shared suffering and mutual humanity despite recent and possibly future attempts to kill each other. These small acts of kindness did not erase the brutality of warfare or resolve the moral complexities of combat, but they created moments where ordinary soldiers chose compassion over cruelty and recognized their enemies as fellow human beings caught in the same terrible circumstances. That Thomas Atkins and thousands of other British soldiers offered cigarettes to men who moments before had been trying to kill them speaks to choices individuals made about maintaining civilized behavior in uncivilized circumstances, one cigarette at a time,